We will move to our next speaker, who is Mr. Jan Rosenau, Director of European Programs, Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP. So if Mr. Jan Rosenau is ready to take the floor, yes?
I'm ready.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I will speak first about the proposals at a high level. I want to pick up on some of the points the previous speakers already made, but then focus my intervention on heating specifically as one of the areas where urgent progress is much needed. So I've worked on energy and climate policy in Europe for quite a long time. I've witnessed 3 energy and climate packages, and this is by far the most ambitious package so far I've seen, given the urgency of the climate crisis, but also the most important energy package overall. First slide, please. Thank you. Let me start with an observation that until recently, EU energy and climate policy was created and implemented very much in different policy silos. For example, we had energy efficiency targets that could be achieved by replacing technologies based on fossil fuels with other fossil fuel technologies, as long as it's delivered energy savings. Renewable energy targets were agreed, but the carbon emission impacts of the installed technologies were not always scrutinized enough. And this needs to change, and I'm happy to see that the new proposal that the Commission put forward indicates that this is indeed happening. There are still some elements of what I call silo policy making in the current proposals, but overall we see much more integrity of the different parts of legislation. There's still significant scope to improve the coherence of European energy and climate policy, to ensure it's well aligned, and the sector integration strategy that we've seen last year being published is an excellent document for that, setting out a very logical way of how the EU can decarbonize its energy system fully. The 2030 55% greenhouse gas reduction goal and the 2050 climate neutrality goal require that all parts of legislation need to be fully aligned and geared towards the full decarbonization of the European economy. So it's good to see that the targets both for renewables and for energy efficiency have been increased and are supposed to be binding now, which is a welcome change. If the European Parliament wants to ensure that we meet the climate goals, it will be very important to at least maintain the current target levels, if not strengthen them. But there is a risk that even if we have strict targets, that progress will not happen as fast as it needs to. Next slide, please. You could take, for example, energy efficiency. Here's a graphic showing you energy consumption over the last years. We've seen some progress, but energy consumption has been stagnating in recent years. Not in 2020, that's because of COVID, but in the years before. And that is partly because there's a gap between what member states report back to the European Commission and what actually happens on the ground. And I've led and been part of 5 evaluations of the Energy Efficiency Directive and know from first-hand experience that the current monitoring and reporting is not as good as it should be. Next slide, please. When you look at renewables, you also see that we made good progress over the last 15 years, but we now need to speed up the rate at which we deploy, especially wind and solar. And this is both to clean up the power sector as it currently is, but also to allow for other sectors to be electrified and also to produce green hydrogen. Think of the transport sector and electric vehicles, but also heat pumps in this area, replacing oil and gas boilers in our homes. Again, the share of renewable energy in 2020 increased slightly, but that is also partly because of COVID and a lower overall final energy consumption. So again, we need to speed up in order to meet those goals. This twin track of reducing demand of energy through efficiency and replacing fossil fuels with increasingly low carbon electricity, it really is the key for decarbonizing heating, which is the second part of my presentation that I wanted to get into. And this is why the IEA and countless other organizations have identified energy efficiency and electrification as the 2 most important levers for a successful heating decarbonization strategy. Next slide, please. So this is a scale of the challenge we face for heating in Europe specifically. The current gas price crisis shows that there is an increased urgency to move away from fossil gas dependency in buildings. And in many member states, that is the biggest consumer of gas. It's often not known, but it's buildings in many member states. This means we need to both reduce energy consumption in buildings, so energy efficiency, and decarbonize the supply. And the scale of the required ambition is very, very significant. By 2030, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 60%, according to the European Commission's impact assessment. That is unheard of. We've never done that in the past. And part of that will need to be achieved by reducing consumption in heating and cooling. That's about a fifth of the reduction. But the other part is decarbonization of supply. Next slide, please. Thank you. Currently, Europe relies quite heavily on biomass for decarbonizing heating and cooling. In 2018, more than 80% of renewable heating and cooling targets across Europe were met through the use of biomass. This will decline somewhat, according to the national energy and climate plans, but it will still be about 2/3 of renewable heating and cooling in 2030, unless there's a change in policy. I don't have time to discuss biomass and the emissions impact it creates in any detail, but the evidence certainly shows that the short-term emission impacts may not be beneficial, and certainly by 2030 and 2050, there may not be a significant contribution to removing emissions. To the contrary. And this is important because we need to reduce emissions now much faster, and of course the European Union has a climate neutrality goal for 2050. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight a second aspect related to heating and cooling. The International Energy Agency published its Net Zero 2050 report earlier this year in August, and this is a graphic from the report. And one of the key elements of that report was an ask to stop installing new fossil heating systems by 2025. The EED proposes that member states can no longer count energy savings from fossil heating systems after January 2024. That's a long way from phasing out new fossil heating systems, but it's still a significant step and would result in more national policy support for energy efficient technologies that do not rely on fossil fuels. Unfortunately, for district heating, the provisions are less ambitious, and Article 24 continues to allow the use and indeed expansion of fossil gas in district heating systems. But again, there is some progress. And finally, I want to point out that there are now more ambitious provisions around ensuring a more equitable energy transition. This is a really important aspect that was previously neglected, and I really welcome the stronger emphasis on equity and fairness. And it will be important in this context to use a significant portion of the carbon revenues from the potential extension of the EU ETS to the buildings and transport sector to offset some of the impact this will have, especially on low-income households. Especially through targeted energy efficiency programs, this can be achieved. Thank you for listening to me. I look forward to the discussion.
So thank you.